Okay, welcome to the Todd Miller Lecture. I really appreciate the nice attendance from both people at the UC Davis community as well as Davis, the city of Davis. Before I introduce Todd, there are several people I want to thank for making this event happen. First, I'd like to thank UC Davis's Institute for Social Sciences and the Interim Director, Professor Marianne Bittler, for their support. In particular, though, I want to thank Assistant Director Vicki Austin, who's standing in the back, and the Institute's Director of Communication, Ben Hinshaw, who's also standing in the back there. They're the ones that actually make the wheels roll on this event and all the events that I've ever worked with them, and I'm deeply have a lot of gratitude for their help over the years. Next, I'd like to thank Department of Political Science and its chair, Professor Eric Engstrom, for generously supporting this event. I also want to thank Dean Kevin Johnson of the UC Davis Law School for his support of this event, as well as the support for many other events that we've put on related to immigration and such issues. Additionally, I'd like to thank Giovanni Perry, professor and chair of the Department of Economics. Giovanni is also the director of the Migration Research Cluster, a multidisciplinary unit focusing on research related to immigration writ large. The cluster has generously also supported this event. And lastly, I want to thank Andrea Gaitan, the director of the UC Davis AB 540 Undocumented Student Center. Although Andrea can't be here, she and her center are tireless workers and advocates for the undocumented student population at UCD. Without the support from these individuals, we couldn't do events like this, and we couldn't host such an important talk as this. To motivate things, 2017 was the second hottest year in history, second only to 2016. From catastrophic flooding, record-setting temperatures, massive hurricanes and wildfires, the likely implications of climate change are readily emerging. And alongside this, we're seeing massive displacement of people who are sometimes called climate refugees. Meanwhile, heated debate in Washington regarding border security is ongoing. It's in the news again today, including increasing the number of U.S. Border Patrol agents, and you can see just how much it has increased over the years, as well as building a massive wall, and this stuff is dominating the news literally as we speak. Well, the increased securitization of the border that Todd talks about in his book, Border Patrol Nation, has had significant effects. Mass detentions, deportations, and the deaths of thousands of migrants on the border has been connected to what Todd calls the border security industrial complex. In his new book, which he's going to talk about today, Storming the Wall, Climate Change, Migration, and Homeland Security, Todd Miller connects the dots. He connects the dots between climatic change, population displacement, securitization. Kirkus Reviews described Todd's book as a, quote, galvanizing forecast of global warming's endgame and a powerful indictment of America's current stance. Storming the Wall is an outstanding, if not chilling, book to read and serves as a natural follow-up to his first book, the critically acclaimed Border Patrol Nation, a book that documents the hyper-securitization of the U.S.-Mexico border. Todd has researched and written about border issues for more than 15 years, the last 7 as an independent journalist and writer. He resides in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands in Tucson, Arizona, but has spent many years living and working in Oaxaca, Mexico. His works have appeared in the New York Times, Times Dispatch, The Nation, Guernica, Al Jazeera English, and Common Dreams, among other places. Additionally, Todd is contributing editor on border and immigration issues for the NACLA report on the Americas and its column Border Wars. In addition to his 2 published books, Todd is currently at work on another project investigating the extension of the U.S. border regime abroad to places far away from U.S. territorial boundaries, but well within its political and economic sphere of influence. So before I bring Todd up here, he's going to speak for about 40-45 minutes, and then we're going to turn it over to you for any questions that you might have. At the culmination of Q&A, we'll have a meet and greet or a book signing with Todd out there in the lobby. The UC Davis bookstore will have some copies of Todd's book available for purchase if you're so interested. So I'm very happy to welcome Todd to UC Davis, and please join me in welcoming Todd to UC Davis.
Hi, good afternoon. It's really an honor to be here, and Brad, thank you so much for that generous introduction. It's really nice to be here in Davis and UC Davis. I'm on a small, short, but very fruitful so far trip from where I live in Tucson, Arizona. I arrived in San Francisco 2 days ago, and I'm heading back tomorrow, so it's a quick trip, but it's really great to be here, and again, I'm honored to be able to speak about this work with you today. As Brad was mentioning, the book, Storming the Wall, is what I'll be discussing, though I'm more than happy to discuss my previous work, especially Border Patrol Nation, if people have questions about that, or if people have read that book. But for now, I'm going to talk about Storming the Wall. And basically, so the subtitle is Climate Change, Migration Displacement, right? Homeland Security, particularly Homeland Security in the sense of border regimes, borders and border regimes. And I look at these three dynamics that are often treated separately, both individually in terms of that each dynamic, whether it be climate change, migration, or borders, have been increasing in impact into the present, and then are projected to increase into the future, and then how these three dynamics intersect, and how they will be a very significant geopolitical reality in this century. The book itself, I did travel quite a bit. I did a couple years of research, really going from place to place. I went to Central America, the Mexico-Guatemala border, all throughout the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, including northern Mexico, Paris, France during the UN summit in December of 2015. And the Philippines, and Washington, D.C. as well. In each of those places, what the intention, well, the book itself is what some have called reportage journalism, or in the sense that there's a lot of storytelling, but storytelling with woven analysis and data and statistics. And so when I would go to each place, I would try to interview as many people as I possibly could on the subject matter, every single possible person. Try to be as thorough as possible, and I try to get the most compelling stories. So in that spirit, I'd like to do the talk in that sense, like share some of the stories that illustrate these points and their convergence. I'm going to hit the different geographical locations, but I'd like to start with the Philippines. For me, the Philippines was a very special place to do this sort of research. I was able to visit the island where my grandmother was born and raised, and for the first time. But when I went there, I went to a place where I had heard stories. This place is called Marinduque for people who are familiar with the Philippines, just south of Manila. I went to a place that I'd heard only stories of a distant past, right? From the 1930s, my grandmother immigrated to the United States in the late 1930s, but all of a sudden I'm on the beach where my grandmother was born and raised, watching for the first time water or the waves of the ocean lap into a house that was semi-destroyed due to sea level rise. The house was now nothing but a carcass on the shore. And when I was looking at that house, I saw a father and his child emerge from the community, the nearby community. And I talked with people from the community, and they told me, well, the sea level has been rising here incredibly. And watched the father and the child, and I looked at them, and actually that's how Storming the Wall opens. Because I took a step away and I started looking at that scene and writing about it, and I started thinking about that child, because obviously the sea was going to affect that community. What they were going to do, they told us, well, we're going to have to move inland at least. And moving inland at least is, being impacted by climate change and having to move because of it, right? Well, maybe inland, maybe, further, to another city, maybe to Manila, what was going to happen with this community. So that sort of began the meditation. But I write more about that in Storming the Wall. Another story that I wanted to share from the Philippines was I went to Tacloban, and I imagine people are familiar with what happened in Tacloban on the island of Leyte. In 2013, the most powerful typhoon ever to hit land hit that area of the Philippines called Typhoon Haiyan. And I went there and I interviewed as I said, a number of people, but including typhoon survivors. And one typhoon survivor who I interviewed was a guy named A.G. Sanyo. And A.G. Sanyo actually lives in Manila, but he was going to visit his family that was there, and he didn't want to bother his family because they all knew the typhoon was coming, on the day before it came. So he went and stayed in a hotel, and the hotel happened to be near the bay, and he stayed on the 4th floor, which was the top floor. But they all knew the typhoon was coming, but nobody was like, yeah, we've seen typhoons before, right? And so he woke up, and actually when I asked A.G., I asked him, can you describe what happened during Typhoon Haiyan? He said, do you have 8 hours? Because I remember every single horrific moment of it. And so then he then summarized what happened. And he said, one of the first things he said was, I woke up, and the roof had, the roof had been torn off, and water was cascading into my room. And then he said every single crack and crevice and hole in the walls, the wind was blowing so hard that it made a high-pitched whistling sound. And he said, I began to plan for my own death. I wonder where my family was going to find me. I was certain I was going to die. And then he finally got up and he went down to the 3rd floor, and there were 60 people congregated on the 3rd floor. Turns out the 3rd floor was the only place you could go. The 1st floor was being flooded by the storm surge. It was inundated. The 2nd floor, the water was rising that high. And so he ended up on the 3rd floor. And I write more about it in the book, but he survives. But he told me, he said, this typhoon, we knew it was coming, and it's like a metaphor for climate change. We know that climate change is coming, and then it hits, and it's worse than we ever could have possibly imagined. And then he said, he ended up staying for 3 days, and he said, with my own 2 hands, I picked up the bodies of 78 people. The Philippine government stopped counting with 6,500 approximately people dead. A lot of people said there was a lot more. Some people say that was 10,000. Some people say 15,000. I heard 20,000 from one organization. The end result is a lot of people died. And then 1 million people approximately were displaced due to the storm. And that's one story I wanted to share. That A.G. Sanyo actually has turned out to be a very prominent climate justice activist, and you can even look him up. He is a very good muralist as well. The second story I wanted to share happened on the Mexico-Guatemala border, and I was in a town called Tenosique, and this town is about 20 miles from Guatemala. It's a place where the train, the Bestia, for people of the Beast, where a lot of people get on the train heading north. And a lot of Central Americans congregate in this town before, going north. And I was in the train yard, and I met these 3 guys from Honduras, and started chatting with them. And they told me they'd been there for 6 days, that they were heading north, that it was way more difficult in Mexico, since for quite a while, but particularly in 2014, really began to plan to start bolstering its southern border with considerable assistance from the United States. And so they talked about, the night before the train left, but it was going too fast. And so, yeah, so they were just waiting to get the next train. And I said, well, what's going on in Honduras? Why are you headed north? And they told, well, one of the guys who was about 17-year-old, he's a 17-year-old kid. They're all small farmers. And he told me, he said, well, there was no rain this year. There was no rain, there was no harvest and no food, hunger, right? And so they were headed north because of no rain. It turns out they're from a part of Honduras, or a part of Central America. It's called the Dry Corridor that goes from Guatemala up through Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua. In Honduras alone, in that particular drought of June of 2015, according to the Honduran government, 400,000 people were impacted. And they actually put out an inadequate but a food assistance program to those farmers who lost their harvests that year. And I talked to a climate scientist who's done modeling in Central America from the University of Arizona, and he said, well, these droughts, they've been happening. So the June 2015 drought was awful, but they've been happening for increasing impact coming up to that point. And according to the model, they are predicted to get worse if things stay the same, right? And by things staying the same, if the global warming keeps warming in the business as usual trajectory that we're in this very moment. And he said, the climate scientist I talked to, he said, well, in my opinion, Central America is ground zero, quote unquote, for climate change in the Americas. And it's not only the drought, but it's Central America is an isthmus, right? So huge bodies of water on either side, and gigantic storms have spun off those bodies of water and really had impacts. There's been Hurricane Mitch is one of the prime examples. I think 7,000 people were killed after Hurricane Mitch happened. And but that, landslides, mudslides, floods, and those sorts of things are predicted to impact Central American countries and southern Mexico and the isthmus area with greater frequency. But obviously, it's not just Central America. It's just it's one hotspot of many global in what's being projected for the future of global climate change, as people here in California know very well, right? The increasing impacts of what's to come they're predicted, if things stay the same, to get worse. And I keep saying that, right, because every report about the future assessments of climate change, usually scientists say, well, we can mitigate this. Maybe we're in a certain sphere where things there are some certain things that might be inevitable, but if we are to do, there's things that we can do to change how we're going about things, including like reducing greenhouse gas emissions and that sort of thing, and that could have at least a manageable effect on what's to come. But anyhow, that's one dynamic. And if you go back to the train yard, if there were 400,000 people, as the Honduran government was saying, in that June of 2015, well, those three guys that I met in the train yard, there had to be more, right? But it's important to mention that, of course, when you talk about displacement or migration of people on the move, as I'm sure everyone knows here, that there's multiple factors that are involved. I like to look at the sociologist Christian Parenti has a kind of theoretical framing that he uses for what's going on in the 21st century, and he calls it the catastrophic convergence. The idea that there's economic dynamic, there are several crises in the world, economic, political, and ecological, increasing crises that are coming together, converging. So they're not separate, they're actually coming together and compounding each other. And Central America perhaps is one of those prime examples, right? And so, but that said, there is data coming out about people who have been displaced directly due to climate change, according to organizations. For example, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center has a statistics that between 2008 and 2015, 21.5 million people per year are being displaced due to climate-related hazards. I think, if I remember correctly, that's like one person displaced every 3 seconds. So several people have been displaced since we've sat here today, according to that. So the so the idea that it's already happening, that the sort of ecological upheavals are happening and people are being displaced, and they don't even, in their numbers, they don't even count the drought situations. And then when you look at the projections in the future, the kind of projections for displacement are astronomical, really. I mean, they're very wide-ranging. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center says by 2050, which is a benchmark year often to make projections, between 150 million and 350 million people will be on the move or displaced due to climate change. The United Nations often uses 250 million as a number. A number that I saw in the New York Times article that came out about maybe 8 months ago, they used 700 million people by 2050. And in that particular article was about Mexico and Mexico City, and Mexico City's problem with water and scarcity of water. And in that article, they also cited a report that was projecting that 1 out of 10 Mexicans between the ages of 15 and 65 would be displaced due to drought, due to hurricanes, due to sea level rise by 2050. And there's even other numbers that are even higher. I've seen billion. I saw a number for 2 billion people by 2100. So the numbers are wide ranging, right? And I did, in Storming the Wall, I interviewed some researchers that were doing kind of empirical research connecting climate change with migration. And one of the researchers told me, well, yeah, those numbers of the future are debated, right? They're debated, but what we can say, if things continue, that it will be staggering, quote unquote staggering, and without precedent in human history, what we're going to see in the future. And so you have, so again, looking at those dynamics, how they've increased into the present and then projected to increase into the future. And so you have climate change and migration, both with certain projections and a business as usual scenario, right? So right now, if you look at climate change, there is no climate refugee status, right? There's no legal framework around climate refugees, neither with in an international sense, though it's very much debated, nor in any individual country, though New Zealand is the one possible exception. I'm not sure if they've actually passed this certain legislation that they're debating at this moment, but it's about admitting 200 or 300 Pacific Islanders who have been displaced due to sea level rise. And so if New Zealand were to do this, I think that would be the very first example of the country, offering some sort of climate refugee status, which I don't know, maybe it would serve as a model for things to come. The number itself, as it stands right now, is a sliver compared to like the numbers the projections I was just saying. However, who knows what would happen? But as it stands now, what happens when people are displaced due to climate? A lot of people will stay close to home, but more and more people are going to cross borders, and that's the third dynamic that I want to talk about, is what people are going to face on the move if they cross borders. More and more likely they're going to face militarized border regimes that are only increasing. And one of the most telling statistics is just the border walls around the globe. If you look at how many border walls there were in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, there were 15 border walls. And today there are 70 border walls. 2/3 of those were constructed after 9/11. So they're moving in accelerated fashion, and I'm actually in constant contact with the person that's doing the tally. And when I was writing Storming the Wall, I think when I started there was 60 some borders, like 63, and they just kept increasing and increasing. It just keeps increasing, right? The amount of border, the border walls in a global sense. And obviously Mexico doesn't have a border wall, and they're bolstering their enforcement regime. So it's not even accurate in terms of how fast this is spreading across the globe. So that's one way to measure it. And then what do these border regimes look like? Well, I can use the United States as an example, right? We can use the United States as an example. While every single border zone is different, they're kind of tailored in the same way. And so you look at the United States and you see the massive increases of the last 25 years. The most massive increase that that we've ever had in U.S. history, really. The slide that Brad showed about the Border Patrol going from 4,000 to approximately 21,000, with the possibility of adding another 5,000, right? So that's even from 4,000 to 21,000, that's a 5-fold increase. Never before have we had this many Border Patrol agents. Customs and Border Protection, the agency formed after 9/11, there are about 60,000, 65,000 agents. That's the parent agency of the Border Patrol. It also has an Air and Marine unit, some refer to it as a domestic Air Force and a domestic Navy. And it's now the largest federal law enforcement agency that we have. And there's also special forces units. There's Border Patrol agents or CBP agents that go out to the desert in ghillie suits that are camouflaged in the desert. So this sort of, along with the people working in the ports of entry, there's now, if you add the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that's another 20,000 agents, ICE, right? And you add, all the different police collaborations and the contracts with detention centers and the incarcerated and the deportations of people, and you have the most massive apparatus that we've ever seen in our lifetimes, right? And you just looking at the budgets, right? You go from the early 1990s of $1.5 billion for border and immigration enforcement. And then today, or 2017, if you just take CBP and ICE, it's $20 billion. So that's a 12, 13-fold increase. $20 billion is more than all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. So FBI, DEA, U.S. Marshals, all the other federal law enforcement agencies come to about $15.5 billion in 2017. The government is definitely focused on immigration and border enforcement. And then how does that manifest? Well, one is the amount of agents. Two is we already have a border wall, right? There is a border wall. There's a lot of talk of a border wall, but there's very little recognition that there is a border wall. About 650, 700 miles of walls and barriers that are placed with a strategy called prevention through deterrence. So the idea that people would die circumventing where the border wall, where the agents were placed, where the technology was placed, was actually contemplated as part of the policy when it was implemented in the early 1990s. And that policy is still present on the borderlands, U.S. borderlands today. But it's not only like border walls, we have all kinds of technologies in southern Arizona at this moment. Albit Systems of America, the Israeli company, just got a contract in 2014, and they're building 52 what they're called integrated fixed towers throughout southern Arizona with cameras that can see 7 miles away, with radar systems, thermal energy cameras, night vision cameras, all that feeding into command and control centers. There's forward operating bases. Those who are familiar with U.S. military operations know about forward operating bases in Afghanistan and Iraq. Well, they're all throughout the U.S.-Mexico borderlands too. This kind of import-export of war is happening in a de facto way on the U.S.-Mexico border. And that's one example of many examples of border enforcement regimes throughout the globe. And this has been increasing in impact up into the present. And obviously, again, we can look at this dynamic and say, well, it's also projected to increase into the future. So we have climate change, migration and displacement, and now border regimes. There are many ways you can look at how border regimes are predicted to increase in the future. One is the president right now, Donald Trump's promises to make that the case. So there's the debate going on right now, right, where different money numbers are put towards, increased border militarization that's happening. So there's that. There's also, a lot of my research has been going to border conventions and private conventions where different private companies come together in expo halls to sell their technologies to border patrols, including the U.S. Border Patrol. And in these conventions, you have, you go into them, and there's a collaboration of vendors that are selling like robots and drones and biometric systems like facial recognition and fingerprints and databases and all kinds of different things. A lot of stuff that won't see the light of day, at least yet. But it's almost looking into like a science fiction-esque reality of the future borderscape, right? And why are they there? Why are they there? Because there's a demand. And the demand is because these border regimes are growing, not only in the United States, but across the globe. So people come to these conventions from everywhere. And all you have to do is look at the market projections. Every single market projection around border security, homeland security, says basically the same thing. Some will say unprecedented growth period. Some will show like growth spurts of 15%. All of it is like one has Homeland Security market doubling from the early 2010s to 2023, from 300 billion to 544 billion. So that's double. So if you have 70 border walls that are in the world and the market's going to double, I mean, you could see, well, this whole thing is getting stronger and stronger. So that's another way to look at what's coming down the road as far as borders. And the last thing I want to look at is taking it back to combining with climate change and migration and assessments, national security assessments that have been made by the Pentagon, that have been made now by the Department of Homeland Security, connecting climate change, migration, and borders. And one really rudimentary, but one of the first ones from the Pentagon was one that imagined a worst case scenario, and it came out in 2003. And I'm going to read just a little bit of it. And it said, so in this, it's a Pentagon commission, but they're imagining a worst case scenario and how the U.S. would respond to such a worst case climate scenario. It says the United States and Australia are likely to build defensive fortresses around their countries because they have the resources and reserves to achieve self-sufficiency. With diverse growing climates, wealth, technology, and abundant resources, the United States could likely survive shortened growing cycles and harsh weather conditions without catastrophic losses. Borders will be strengthened around the country to hold back unwanted starving immigrants from the Caribbean islands, an especially severe problem, which should resonate considering what happened in the Caribbean this past fall. Borders will be strengthened around the country to hold back unwanted starving immigrants from the Caribbean islands, an especially severe problem, Mexico and South America. So that's one assessment. I imagine they meant Central America as well, and maybe perhaps they were geographically challenged. But that's probably one of the first rudimentary such assessments, and it's worth taking a step back and thinking about like Washington and climate change, and particularly right now, because the president is a renowned climate denier. He's called climate change a hoax like 300,000 times. He's also been wildly contradictory in his actions. Really, I mean, there's been some really chilling effects especially around climate scientists, scrubbing climate change out of certain like archives of departments and that sort of thing. But at the same time, you got to think of the government as many moving parts. And there's certain parts of the government that do not deny climate change at all. And one of them is the Department of Defense, and one of them is the Department of Homeland Security. And the Department of Defense, like one example of this, in 2008, they came out with a book of assessments, probably thicker than this book, looking at different temperature assessments, like if it was 1.6 degrees by 2040, 2.6 degrees by 2040, 4 or 5 degrees by 2100, and what would happen. And it basically, they're a little bit more polished than what I just read you, but basically the same sort of conclusions are drawn. But one of the big important things that they mentioned was for a national security planner to plan ahead, to bring the military, what they call a military platform, from the drawing board to the battlefield. It takes 30 years. So that goes to like, what do we think of when we think of the Pentagon in terms of risk assessors? They probably have the most superior risk assessors you can imagine, especially in terms of US interests, right, around the world. And there's no possible way they're going to deny what a 97% consensus of scientists are saying that's going to happen in the future due to climate change. So they are very much looking at impacts of climate change. And there's been big reports and assessments, all the way up to now, right through the Trump administration. I've seen several assessments. And so in 2010, that was the first year that climate change was joined a slew of other top threats to U.S. national security, but that was when it was declared a top threat to U.S. national security. And then it became, I can give a lot of examples, but then it became part of the quadrennial reviews. The quadrennial reviews of the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security. Quadrennial review is the most public statement of mission for the DoD and the DHS. So for example, when the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, put climate change as a top national security threat in the 2014 quadrennial review, what it does is then climate change does become a lens through which DHS looks at its 5-point mission. Its 5-point mission, to remind, is 1 is counterterrorism, 2 is immigration enforcement, 3 is border security, 4 is cybersecurity, and 5 is critical infrastructure. So each of those mission statements, they look at through the lens of a number of other threats they have identified, but now climate change has become one such threat. And if you look at the climate adaptation plan, you look at the quadrennial review, you see the statement that we need to prepare our borders for the possibility of future mass migrations to the United States. And also included in these assessments are predictions of the very drought that left those 3 guys in the Tennessee train yard on the Mexico-Guatemala border. And that was one example of what might displace people. You don't have to go to anywhere else but the DHS documents to see them talking about such droughts, among many other things. And so that's, so you have like these 3 kind of trifecta dynamics coming together, and which could very much come to, you can argue already is coming to a head in many ways on planet Earth. And I just want to, before like going to discussion, I wanted to, because I also, when I was researching Storm the Wall, I mean, those years of research, I went to many different places and talked to so many different people, and just met a lot of people that were doing a lot of things based on these 3 issues, sometimes in convergence with each other, other times separately. But there has been many different people, organizations that I've met that are doing really incredible things. I assume that even right here, even though I don't know you, many people are doing incredible things here in this audience. And I wanted to end by stressing one such thing that I witnessed, and I wanted to talk about right on the U.S.-Mexico border, where I went to a place for people familiar with Arizona, Sonora border. I went to a place just east of Agua Prieta, which is just southeast of Tucson, on the Mexican side, and to visit an ecological restoration project. And so I went there, and the first thing the guides that I met up with they wanted to show me was not their ecological restoration project. It was actually this part of the border wall that had been dragged inland into Mexico. So in 2014, Hurricane Odile, the remnants of it or part of it hit Arizona pretty hard, and especially the Chiricahua Mountains in eastern Arizona. water just lashed out of these mountains down the washes and then slammed right into the U.S.-Mexico border and taking parts of the wall and the barrier with it. And so they were showing me this part of the the barrier that was about a quarter-mile inland. That's how far the water dragged it. And what was so impressive, well, the quarter mile was so impressive, but also the fact that planet Earth was eating this barrier alive. It was literally like covered with soil. I mean, soil was absorbing it. There were purple flowers growing on it. There were arachnids and spider webs hanging from real spiders, and it was just it was a sight to behold. But from there you could see, it was Silver Creek for people that are familiar with the area. So up Silver Creek you could see straight ahead to where the border barrier had been reconstructed. So Homeland Security had reconstructed the border barrier. Mind you, the 700 miles of walls and barriers, the current one costs about $4 million per mile on average to construct. So I could see from where I stand the new border barrier. Behind it was a Border Patrol agent in a green stripe vehicle who was looking at us. Behind the Border Patrol agent was a surveillance tower, the Elbit Systems Tower I just mentioned. And in front, on the Mexican side, was what were called gabions. And gabions were embedded in the stream bed of Silver Creek, which is dry. And gabions are steel cages filled with rocks, and they're meant to slow down the monsoon rains that you get in Arizona. So then the soil will drink the water, the earth will be replenished, and to restore the habitat. And by God, that's exactly what was happening. So they pointed out, like, this project had been going on for about 10 years, and they were saying, well, look, the native grasses are growing back. Look, the desert willows are growing back. Oh my God, the water table has risen 30 feet. And this, to me, was amazing because southern Arizona, northern Mexico has been in a 15-year drought. And the water table was rising 30 feet. All the other water tables were not rising at all around. The water table was rising not only on the Mexican side, it was rising on the U.S. side. Did not respect the border, it was going on the other side. And also, there was an ejido that was dead set against, an ejido, a community in Mexico, about 10 miles to the south, dead set against the water project because the scarcity of water had been so prevalent. And then after a couple of years, they started seeing water coming in places they hadn't seen water before. And the creek that was running 3 months out of the year started to run 4 months out of the year, then 5 months out of the year. I mean, small, very small, up-to-date, incremental changes, but changes that are huge, very significant, especially when you look at some of the national security assessments that I was just mentioning. Like the national security assessment that in northern Mexico that there's going to be a scarcity of water and people are going to be displaced and migration is going to be a result of it. Well, here's an example of that, water, maybe small scale, but water is coming back in a community. And so I'm sitting there and I'm looking at the gabions, which look like an intricately carved wall itself, like a stone wall. Like it was, you could see that wall and then the border barrier and then the surveillance tower and the Border Patrol car. And remind you again, $20 billion. $20 billion is the Border and Immigration Enforcement budget for 2017. And so I'm looking at the two, and it's like, well, yeah, there's many choices we have for the 21st century, right? Like many things we can think of, many options, but is this not one of them, right? Is this like, here's like a tale of two walls. We could, why so much investment in one thing and so little investment in the other? And so I asked one of the founders of Cuenca Los Ojos, which is the name of the organization. I asked them, like, what could you do with $20 billion? And then she looked at me and she said, I didn't have my recorder on like a fool. She just started talking and just gushed. Like, she started talking about like way, talked about regions way far away. Like, we could do all this stuff with the $20 billion. And so, yeah, I'll leave the discussion, my talk with that. It's small scale, but perhaps there are, other choices that we have as we proceed. And maybe like there are ways we can make those three dynamics that I was talking about not so inevitable.
Let's see, so, sorry, I'm totally formulating the question, but I do have to go. So, I was wondering if you could just comment, given that the Arizona State University educator and activist was recently detained by Customs and Border Protection, and it's the picture you paint of how the U.S. is currently preparing for this crisis, which is basically, we have the story all on one side, which is increasing militarization, which goes kind of hand in glove with the spirit of xenophobia and nationalism and racism that brought Trump into power in the first place. So currently the way the story looks like it's going is that that is being developed because it feeds into our current leadership, it benefits the current capitalist system, and so the way that it's manifesting is by clamping down through, ICE raids, through men like this activist getting detained. And so from my point of view, it's hard to see from the counteracting this tide of xenophobia and nationalism, how we can tackle that at so many levels, so all the way from literally the ground up, so from the earth, from changing people's minds about this kind of fortress mentality that's developing, and overcoming all these forces of nationalism, capitalism that are thriving in what is becoming a kind of increasingly dire climate context.
So you want me to comment on
Two about it.
Sure. Yeah, I hear you. Geez, it seems like, it almost seems when, obviously you have to, at least in my opinion, you have to look at the huge dynamics that are happening, like nationally, globally, and at the same time, when you think about if you want to change those things, it's almost like it's still important to look at those, those gigantic dynamics. But it seems like, at least what I've seen in my own experience, that a lot of the hope I get is from what people are doing in smaller groups and grassroots organizations and in smaller scale sorts of ways that then maybe accumulate to create, sometimes political pressure to change things, and sometimes, like the ecological restoration project that I was just describing. Well, now there's a ton of them, and they become an example for somebody else to do that same thing. And then how does, what I'm trying to say in a long-winded way is that when we're looking at the nation state, right, the nation state, when you just look at the climate crisis, right, they failed. The nation state system has completely failed. Like, they had 23 years to knowing what was coming down the pipe. And it wasn't until 2015, right, after 23 years of it, that the Paris Accords were agreed upon. And even those are, as have come out, are extremely inadequate. And projections have it at 3 to 4 degree, even more temperature rise, even if countries were to go by the Paris Accords. And so, like, this kind of model of nation state seems to be problematic, right? In terms of the climate crisis, it's definitely failed, right? But at the same time, that's what we got. So how do you balance those things together, and then how can power be devolved in certain places and enhanced in other places, and How can we tackle these issues more?
A more targeted question would be, are there in other, since the research you've done internationally, are there places where you've seen campaigns pushing back against this type of specifically nationalism and xenophobia that have been effective in taking some pressure off the borders?
Well, pardon?
Please repeat the question.
Sorry. To refine my long rambling question, I was going to ask if in your international research, if you have seen movements that have been pushing back against the nationalism and xenophobia, which then eases pressure off the borders.
I definitely, you definitely see movements that push against nationalism and xenophobia just about everywhere. I mean, while at the same time, nationalism and xenophobia are happening simultaneously. Whether that eases the pressure on the border, I guess it could. Like, the stronger the critical mass of the movement becomes and the more politically unfavorable it is to continue this creation of borders. But what we've been seeing over the last 20 years, 25 years, especially post 9/11, is this stampede towards a securitized world. That doesn't seem to be stopping, and all the forecasts show it increasing, and the border walls are being constructed day in, day out in many different places, and border patrols are being formed all over the world in different places that never had them before, and that's what you're seeing right now. But you're seeing more and more, there is quite a bit of pushback, and I imagine that the pushback will get stronger and more powerful as we proceed.
Yes, I'd just like to thank you for coming today. My question is on extraction, the oil industry, specifically Standing Rock. What's your commentary on what happened in Standing Rock, specifically with the Homeland Security involvement in the FBI and the extreme violence that was perpetuated upon the protesters there? Because it ties right into because we're talking about, we're living in a time of extreme climate change when people rise up to protect our planet, our Earth, and then they are the subject of extreme violence.
Yeah, I think the Standing Rock example is one of the most prescient examples of what's happening that you could possibly bring up in this moment. I know that our Border Patrol was sent there. U.S. Border Patrol was sent to Standing Rock, and they had an operation. Their operation, they claim, was only 10 days, but according to other people I talked to, I wasn't there, but I talked to different people, that they were there throughout, and that they were brought there primarily for their expertise in blockading mobility and blockading movement and setting up roadblocks and supporting the police when they were doing such things. And I imagine, and actually this is a project that I've considered working on, but I haven't been able to, but I would like to do like a federal, a Freedom of Information Act request on the federal government around the Standing Rock operations and Homeland Security. Because I imagine that maybe they have drones in North Dakota as well, surveillance drones that might have been being used, but I don't know if they were or not. So I'd be interested in seeing the extent of it, but that's a really, really prime example. So it also points to the sharpest of ironies, right? You have the Border Patrol that is stationed on the border, right, the U.S.-Mexico border, and they're blocking the mobility of people that are perhaps displaced for many reasons, but perhaps the ecological reason due to the fossil fuel economy, right? The oil pipelines that Standing Rock was trying to stop from happening. And at the same time, they're there also protecting and enabling such oil pipelines to be built, being a part of a bigger apparatus that was playing a part in that. And to me, that kind of almost says it all.
When you read the Pentagon's report from 2003, it said United States and Australia, where I think it's like building a fortress. What was that in reference to regarding Australia?
Yeah, you'll have to ask the Pentagon people. Yeah, I don't know why they were speaking for Australia, but it was an assessment. So what they were doing was looking at a future scenario. So they were kind of imagining this future scenario, how it would impact the United States, and then also how it would impact the globe. And part of the assessment is, well, then, people are going to be displaced everywhere. And so there will be lots of people, going to Australia, for example. And if you think about it too, when that report came out in 2003, if you look at, especially, you look at the United States border apparatus, it's really considerably fortified since that report came out. Not saying that report directly was the cause of it, but it's interesting that they predicted defensive fortresses. And after that, well, Border Patrol doubled, right? We went into the big hiring surge that hired 6,000 Border Patrol agents right after, lots of things happened. And I believe similarly, but I don't know for sure because I haven't really studied Australia to the extent that I maybe should, but I know that Australia has also bolstered its border apparatus, and I think they even have the same name, the Border Customs and Border Protection. I think that's the only other country that has CBP as a name. So you can see like that how it's been happening too, right? But that was an assessment, so they're kind of speculating when they say that.
Hi, very interesting talk. I've thought about this a little bit, and I think long term, I think we mess with nature. And nature is striking back with all the droughts and the weather, and I think ultimately there will be a rebalancing. There'll be a lot of people, a lot of famines and starvation, and the population will drop, which again will kind of rebalance things in terms of nature. I think, unfortunately, it's going to be really hard on the poorest people of the world. I think the United States, we have the resources to survive this, but the third world are going to pay the price. And I think it's going to be very messy. I agree with you about people trying to move and borders and all that stuff, and I think it's going to be a very militaristic time because our privilege will be defended. So I'd like your comments on the whole thing. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, I mean, that's still, the future's unwritten, right? And the future's unwritten, so we can talk, we can project, and, that's basically what you just said, is basically what a lot of the national security assessments are saying too, right? Yeah, it remains to be seen what happens, right? The future, there could be many things that happen, and there's always unexpected victories, and yeah, it's hard to say what's going to happen, and obviously, as you say, the dynamics that are manifesting are quite dire, but it's still, who knows, it remains to be seen, and I think that all of us, and we have a role we're playing in it, and we can do things about it in many different ways.
I'd like to see the discussion shift in a positive direction. One of the things that you revealed in your talk is that there are many people, many scientists, many research organizations that are looking at things, investigating, and finding ways to do it. There's a lot that's positive. And at my age, you need to
Yeah.
people behind you are going to get it together and get to work and solve some of these problems. Because there's more and more educated people, there's more concern about global issues, and I think we can do it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a lot. And I mean, I could probably spend the rest of the night talking about all the different things that I found inspiring. The subject matter of this book seems quite dire, but I was quite inspired so many times while going through this book, just all the different people that I met and they were doing all kinds of different things and on different scales and in different capacities, but do offer perhaps guidance into a world that's not inevitably negative, right? So there's, there's the future's unwritten, right? What are we going to, how are we going to make the future?
I just wonder if there's any roadmap or what would it take to stop global warming? Most of the projections continue up. I wonder, suppose Paris climate report had been really serious. Are there parameters or are there designs that one would hope would actually either pause or perhaps reverse these trends?
Well, for what I know, a lot of scientists do say they underscore the point that we can still make things more manageable than in the business as usual scenario. It looks pretty dire, and so things are going to have to happen, right? And I know there's lots of different visions from it, and one definitely is moving away from this fossil fuel economy and thinking about energy and how are these lights here powered, and the cars that we drive and the planes that we fly in, and really reconfiguring. It's going to take some pretty huge systematic changes and also personal changes for people that are used to certain doing things a certain way, and that's got to start happening like yesterday, right? And so those sorts of things, from what I hear, and I'm definitely not a scientist, I'm just reporting on a lot of scientific reports, is that there is still a chance to really, to mitigate it at least. There's certain things I think that a lot of people agree that have been set forth, and they're going to be hard to avoid. One of them is sea level rise. And so if sea level rise is going to be hard to avoid, if the Arctic ice sheets are going to melt, right? And there's possibility of slowing it down, maybe. Then you have to start rethinking, the city's going to get flooded, and these people are. So instead of having massive crises of displacement, maybe a more thoughtful way of thinking about things could be enacted in places that will be impacted for sure, right? So there are ways, and it's just a matter of, part of me thinks it's not gonna, it doesn't seem like it's, especially now, with a certain administration it doesn't seem like there's much going on. It's almost like we have to do it we have to begin and step up ourselves and really start going from the ground up, and because it doesn't seem like from the top down it's happening.
Thanks, Todd, for an interesting talk. I guess it's partly an answer to Anush, who was on my left here, who asked the first question, where I did see a real pushback in terms of against nationalism and xenophobia that was kind of remarkable. Was in Europe in, I think, 2013, with the refugee crisis tragedy unfolding from Syria, and the death of that little boy, Haiyan on the beach. And it really brought out compassion in people, because there was a huge response across Europe. And it suddenly, even in Britain, the kind of right-wing papers who are constantly fueling anti-immigrant stuff changed their tune. He was a young boy who died, and it personalized a crisis, and actually brought out the best of people. So you had people in train stations welcoming people. 1 million people got, one of the few governments that actually responded to their people's compassion was Germany, and gave and accepted 1 million migrants. And so it shows that there is potential. I think that's part of it, is to to draw out the human stories in this and to show the cost. It's so much painted in big numbers, but actually we're talking about kids, we're talking about brothers, we're talking about sisters that we can all identify with, and so that's a way that I think it can be this can be turned around. And I just wanted to, my question to you then is really what you've seen in terms of kind of resistance to the kind of security state along the borders, and what kind of, perhaps you could tell us some of these inspiring stories of what people are doing in terms of refugee solidarity, in terms of challenging the security state, in terms of challenging ICE and so on the borderlands. Where can we see the best of human nature in the work you do down in the borders?
I think like any borderlands, I can talk directly. By the way, this is Nick Buxton, and he actually edited and wrote a very good book on a similar theme of climate change and displacement called The Secure and the Dispossessed, a book that I would highly recommend. Like thinking of, I've been to many, just everywhere you go, there's always people doing things that are just amazing. And if I think of where I live in Tucson, she brought up the incident of the humanitarian worker who was arrested by the Border Patrol just a couple days ago, where he worked giving assistance to people who cross the border in the West Desert of Arizona. And he's a volunteer, a professor at Arizona State University who spends his time, his weekends volunteering to go help people, because he knew him and other people in this huge, broad, this ever-growing organization called No More Deaths, knows that people crossing the border are going to be in distress. It's impossible to bring enough water. It's impossible to bring enough food. People are walking days and days and days in the desert, and often are going to need medical assistance. So you have No More Deaths, right? No More Deaths volunteers that not only are doing humanitarian work, they're actually, it's resistance to the heavy security state that is in the region they're working with. So in the summer, for example, they have a camp which is maybe 20 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border that was raided by the Border Patrol, where they arrested 4 people that were receiving medical aid in the clinic, right? So they're putting themselves in places where the border, Homeland Security doesn't want them to be, and really in a way influencing the narrative. There's No More Deaths. There's other organizations, Humane Borders, that Brad goes. I think you're going next week, right, down to put out water in the desert. There's other, Samaritans is another group that goes and looks for people in distress. And those are just humanitarian aid groups. No More Deaths also has a very much of a political sphere to it, and just put out a huge report that's getting a lot of attention. In fact, the report is about Border Patrol destroying humanitarian aid, destroying the water that they're putting out. There's documented evidence of Border Patrol kicking over water jugs, and so they did a huge report on it. And so a lot of the thoughts are that this ASU professor who was arrested was a retaliation arrest by Homeland Security. So there's a political point to it. There's also a lot of binational, which I think is really important, this kind of binational, when you think about climate change and what's going on, and the idea that activism or the sort of organization is limited to an artificial imposed border, right, seems a little bit ridiculous, because it's affecting everywhere, right? And people are, you see it in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands as kind of cross-border organization in many different capacities, like the ecological restoration thing that I mentioned a little bit ago. That's one example, but there's many examples, including political examples, including examples around economic issues too, which are much broader, where the contingents from the 3 NAFTA countries go to meet together and discuss entirely new economic models and try to push for that, And so there's so many examples that, just thinking just right off the top of my head without any preparation, and I could just go on and on about it. And that's, the fact that I can go on and on about it is what really, you were alluding to, there is, some things can change, and there's a capacity to do it, right? It's just a matter of getting things done in a way.
We have time for one more question.
No, we don't have time for that. It's called the agenda setting function. Because I want to give people time to meet Todd. So Todd's going to be out there in the foyer. There's an opportunity for just go see if you're interested or just talk to Todd. I told my students that they take selfie with Todd or whatever, so that's going to happen. But anyway, I want to thank you for a very